Yukio Mishima knew all the way back in the 1960s that men had fallen. And today we are going to hear Mishima talk at length about the causal factors of what happened to us men in the modern world. And here on Right Conscious, we actually talk about Yukio Mishima. This isn't a superficial channel where I cherry pick Mishima quotes to inject my religious and political philosophy into your brain. Instead, we talk about his books, his life, and his philosophy because I do believe that Mishima was one of the best fiction writers of the 20th century. And first and foremost, I have to talk about this because when most people talk about the degeneracy of men, they look back and idolize and romanticize the past. They say, oh, look at this time where men were men. But Mishima, through his works, if you read the Sea of Fertility Tetralogy or the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, critique that. He wasn't a very big fan of the Meiji Restoration. And he, like anyone else who has a brain, understands that what is heartbreaking about men in 2024 is not that we aren't like the men of the past, but we didn't evolve in what we could have become. Because behind closed doors, men and women and people of all races were pieces of shit in the past because it was a cutthroat world and you basically had to be. But with modern stability, with access to tens of millions of books on shadow libraries where you can educate yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, there really is no excuse to be a piece of crap anymore. And when we look at the pathways back for us to gain our masculinity that are offered to us in 2024, they are a bunch of bullshit. And I talk about all the time about the mytho-poetic movement of the 90s and actual individuation and actually tapping into masculinity. But the definition of masculinity has become so screwed up that we think that David Goggins or the dude that's has a bunch of money or is doing sales calls on YouTube is a masculine individual. We think that the religious guy who has a family and has a farm and rides around on the horse is masculine when he actually hasn't individuated at all. Because when you look back at the ancient tales, when you look back at Iron John and the Fisher King and many of the other fables that we grew up with in the Western world, and there were very similar ones in the Eastern world, the end result is much higher than just grilling and chilling, than getting the trophy wife and having a bunch of land and calling it quits. And that's what so many of us idolize. And enough for me. Let's hear from Mishima because he's going to kind of drive this point home. Quote, how is a man who is competing with other commercial firms while making as many as 120 phone calls a day from the company's president's office active? And when Mishima says active here, Mishima is saying that the root of masculinity is action, is motion. Returning, how is a man who is praised for increasing company profits by traveling to an underdeveloped country and going around and swindling its residents active? Such dregs of vulgar society are generally attached to the people who are called active in our time. And that is a shift of definition because Mishima talks about this divine action. Because when you are aligned with your divine purpose, when you are aligned with the great work, which is awakening through your divine purpose. Yes, I'm saying the word divine. This is insane, everyone. So many logic bros, so many little atheists out there. So many Christians are probably getting triggered too right now. Because when you actually connect to the highest source, that is the God above God, and then you increase your personal signal enough to understand what your purpose here is, and then vet that information by shedding layers of your ego and then sitting in silence with that over a period of time so you know it's just not your head talking, then you can start taking inspired action. Then you can start harmonizing pen and sword. But instead, we just focus on making everything as economical as possible. When you look, for instance, at martial arts, Mishima was into kendo, and it's really funny to look back and it's kind of cringe, even judo with stuff like jujitsu and wrestling and kickboxing and these things. When you learn them, it makes things like Tai Chi or Qigong or like any of this stuff seem obsolete. Because even if you have a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, you can go smack those guys around. But that wasn't the point in the first place of martial arts. We've turned it into this whole idea of self-defense and whatnot. But the actual purpose of martial arts and of reading and of being in a relationship is to be inspired and to be aligned with that divine action, to be in motion. And so instead, we have been totally thrown off course because we have a choice now. Even though we are living and born into this capitalist world where we are basically wage slaves from day one and everything is formed in front of us and our parents did a shitty job and basically threw us into public education and programmed us to not be creative and not see our way out of it, you can find your way out of the labyrinth. And this is what happens in a country that has a GDP. This is what happens when you believe in communism and capitalism. This is what happens when you can't transcend the mommy and daddy dialect. Oh, who am I going to vote for? Trump or Kamala? Oh my God. There's only two choices. Make the best choice. Lesser of two evils. When people look back at us in the past, if those people have actually evolved, they're going to laugh at us. They're going to look at us how we look at little serfs. Like, oh my God, they were caught in binary thinking. They thought that democracy was different than monarchy. Holy crap. And Mishima was onto this. Obviously, he got sucked into many of the malignant radical philosophies of his time because he was innovative. But now let's get down to it. What happened to men? How did this process start? How did the most active men, how did all this action get displaced? Because before you were in this controlled society, you necessarily couldn't live out this individuated creative process without getting burned on the stake. And so there was this period of time where we gained the freedom of expression, but we lost something else. And what was that? And we're about to hear from Mishima again. Quote, while smeared in the filth of this vulgar world, people watch the heroic archetypes deteriorate, die, and emit a piteous, wretched stench. Young men must watch with frustration the heroic archetypes that they once learned from the comic strips of boys' magazines be subjected to cruel defeat and putrefaction in the future society in which they will ultimately be placed. And they cry out in rejection of the entire society that destroys the heroic archetypes and desperately attempt to protect their own small gods. And that's what we're doing right now. Mishima has it correct. Everyone's talking about the degeneracy of society. Look at this, look at this. And we try to protect our own little world, our own little religion, and we are being selfish. We are not living this out. I mean, this really became apparent to me in 2020. And I've said this so many times, but I know so many men who call themselves real men who disagreed about some of the stuff that was going on, but they went along with it just because some elected officials who claim moral authority over others say you need to do something doesn't mean you need to do it. And there may be consequences. Your life may become significantly harder, but we're not ready for that. And we are not really. And that was the ultimate test, that we are basically donezo, that we have been so far removed from any heroic archetype that these men of the past seem insane. These revolutionaries that, overthrew many different governments in the 20th century and in the 19th century have to have trigger warnings now, because in our society, that thought isn't even allowed. And I'm not even advocating for a revolution. But who are our heroic archetypes? Like I was saying earlier, David Goggins, Alex Hormozy, Donald Trump. Like, who are these people? People used to worship gods. People used to have transcendent experiences and a transcendent gaze towards something that was pulling them up. And now we think that we can all handle it ourselves and that we're all good. And how has that worked out? How is the male suicide rate going? Are men getting happier, healthier, and more intelligent every single year? And this is hard to quantify. The logic bros, the leftists, and I'll call them that because the rightists are just as dumb in my opinion, but the leftists have done everything that they can to destroy masculinity. And then over on the right, the people who are supposed to push back against that have doubled down on their small gods. They've doubled down on a religion that no one cares about anymore, that is not going to ever make a comeback. Instead of focusing on archetypes and systems and ideas that are fresh and have zero baggage involved. But when heaven gets involved, when the afterlife gets involved, then we have to sit and slog for 5,000 more years. We have to sit and be like, all right, well, we're slowly going to move away from this because we have to let these people believe X, Y, and Z. All right. In Mishima's analysis about how we got here, about the loss of these archetypes, aligns with Carl Jung, aligns with the best thinkers that I know. I don't know anyone. Did you go with your dad to work? Did you understand what your dad did for a job? Or was it some random ass job? We have no connection to father figures. We have no connection to any aspect of initiation or ritual. We have no connection to any community. And so our only option right now is to go join the weak ruling religion and their weak systems that really don't help very much, especially in the long run. Or we have to go on this solo journey of spirituality, which is really a problem because it needs to be a global thing. And it's just like, we can't figure that out yet. And so here we are with a million YouTube videos, with elections, with a million distractions, and no one is doing this. As Mishima says, we are literally smeared in the filth, watching these old things die, and we're all acting like a bunch of preppers, when instead we all have access to scalable media, whether you are writing, whatever you want to do online to actually push this. We have access to in-person interactions. That's the other thing that's been blown up with divine action. There has to be boots on the ground action. You're supposed to make a community. You're supposed to be with other people. As much as I preach about how digital media and these types of things and writing online can reach a global audience, and it is the path. Eventually, once people are awakened, we have to come together and actually start to organize. And people are so selfish that it's probably never going to happen, because within the heroic archetypes and those stories and those lessons, what was the main lesson? The main thing always, even in religion, is always it's bigger than you. It's not all about you. But now in our society, it's all about you. And once again, we witnessed that in 2020, that people took what they thought were immoral actions or actions they basically 100% disagreed with for money to make themselves more comfortable. And in the past, there were revolutions and crazy stuff and actual pushback, real pushback for stuff that was 1% as egregious. And so the way to transcend this, and it's funny, is at some level postmodernism. And I'm not saying the application of postmodernism on the world, but it's funny how these things work. That postmodernism has been one of the reasons that we are at where we are at right now. But the philosophy of transcending limits and the hierarchy and moving and creating something new is the best option right now, because returning to the old is not working, will not work. And anyone who tells you that is just trying to hold on to their little piece of a small god before it eventually is consumed. So thank you guys for being here. I know this was kind of a hardcore and polemic rant, but that's what Mishima creates. And I will see you guys all very soon.